Welcome to the last and final class of this course on Jewish law. And this is lesson number 14, where we're going to discuss going beyond the letter of the law, which is a great example also in relationships which one has with relatives, with a spouse, with children, with parents. And we're going to use that also as a relationship with God to get an example of how a proper relationship functions. So let us begin with the introduction. And Elias, if you'd like to start reading.
In a relationship with God, introduction. Is doing the Jewish thing like crossing off a giant checklist? Is there more to Judaism than keeping score of how many mitzvot one can do? How do we not get lost in the intricate details of halacha? What lies beyond the letter of the law?
Yeah, very good. Okay, so these are very good questions. Many people don't appreciate so much Judaism or traditional aspects of it because they feel like there's someone, a principal or some really mean teacher, bringing them back to their school days. As adults, we don't appreciate school days. No one likes the boss that's always on top of them, making sure that they're doing everything properly. And sometimes we could get to this impression that Judaism operates in the same way. There's someone watching every step, and we have to make sure we did this, we didn't do that, and we're just waiting to get out of school. We're waiting to get out of this obligation of having to fulfill the mitzvot. So of course, this is the incorrect approach. And this is what we're going to a little bit elaborate in this class, how one should view the general commandments that God gives us. Let's begin with idea number one. And Sheila, if you'd like to please read big idea number one.
The spirit of the law. Halakha is not just a list of do's and don'ts. Rather, there is also the spirit of the law and the general value behind the law. When we follow halakha, that must also reflect its values.
Yeah, very good. So here we have point number one is let's start with the foundation. What would you call, I think we had this joke already beforehand. They say there was a teacher that was in charge of ethics in the school, and he was caught doing something inappropriate. So the school board calls them in for a meeting and they say, we think it's inappropriate for someone from the Board of Ethics, a teacher that's teaching the ideas of ethics to the students, should be caught doing such an inappropriate behavior. So he said, well, in the past, I've taught at another school and I was teaching geometry and no one asked me why I wasn't the triangle. He's in his mind, just because I'm teaching ethics doesn't mean I have to act in an ethical way. So idea number one is to dispel that notion of thinking. Everybody gets upset if they'll find out that a rabbi was behaving in a certain inappropriate way. Is that a legitimate displeasure or legitimate shock that just because he's teaching, he might respond? Doesn't mean that I have to behave appropriately. I could teach and yet behave differently. But people are not happy with that, rightfully so, because the spirit of the law is not just there to tell you what you have to do, but it's supposed to shape the person that overall he gets the idea of how he's supposed to behave. This works well in a marriage. One doesn't make a list of do's and don'ts in their marriage and tell their spouse, if you're willing to marry me, sign over here. Why don't we make a contract in a marriage like you do in business, where you hire lawyers and you spend months and months researching and detailing every single nuance of how you want this relationship to happen. Just like you make a contract with selling a business, you'll have thousands of pages. And that way we would avoid all problems. The answer is because that's not the type of relationship you're looking for. You want a relationship where the person is not only doing it because so says in the contract, but that they understand it on their own. They're feeling the interest, they're feeling the desire to do not just what they're told to do, but that they're interested on their own to do it. That's what we call the spirit of the law. It might not say it explicitly, but if you get the idea of the law, you'll want to do this as well. So let's take here an activity just momentarily. We won't go through this too long, so it doesn't take up that much time. But we'll read these statements on the left, and then we'll, in our minds, answer if you think this is something you strongly agree, somewhat agree, undecided, or disagree. So let's take some of these questions. And again, this is not to say that this is the proper response. The question is just, where is one holding? So starting with the first question, when an opportunity to do a mitzvah arises, I usually procrastinate. Of course, one only procrastinates in areas where they're not excited. Find a child that's very difficult, has a hard time with getting up for school. Tell him one day that you're going on a trip to his favorite wonderland, and he'll be up 4 a.m. packing his bags, excited. It's not that he has a problem waking up in the morning. He has a problem waking up for things that he doesn't have an interest in. So if someone's procrastinating with something, it's usually because it's not exciting. Mitzvot connote restrictions. Sometimes people feel that a mitzvah, which actually comes from the word connection, some people would feel that it very much restricts them. This second question actually has a lot to do with the education that one received. If one had a parent that was very harsh, very strict, severe, always giving punishment, that was their mode of educating, then that will also spill over in how they perform the commandments, how they connect to God. They gave over the whole religion in the way they think, which is in a very restrictive way. I take my time doing mitzvot and enjoy the beauty of fulfilling God's commandments. Would someone say they strongly agree, somewhat agree, or disagree? This is, again, the opposite of number one. If one feels interested and excited, then they'll do it. And so on. I try to do as many mitzvot as I can. Does one agree or not? Following the Torah can be burdensome. Does one feel that way? I want to learn more about the mitzvot. I look forward to Shabbat's end, or do I look forward to Shabbat's beginning? Which one do I appreciate? So these are questions, food for thought. And now let's get on to this part of the class, which is going to discuss what is supposed to be the outlook. Is it just follow what it says and then look to run away? Or is this supposed to shift the person's attitude in general in life, and supposed to shift his character, how he behaves, how he talks, how he walks, how he interacts, that in every aspect you feel this person has the spirit of the Torah, not just doing the do's and don'ts of the Torah. Let's start with the sources, as always. Where do we find this in the Torah? And Eliyav, if you'd like to read over here what we have on the screen from the top and including text number 1.
What lies beyond the letter of the law? Be holy. Aside from the letter of the law, there is also the spirit of the law. Perhaps the most famous example of the spirit of the law is this verse. And God spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for one, the Lord your God, am holy. Or for I, the Lord your God, am holy. I don't know why I read that as a no.
Yeah. So this is a verse in the Torah, very famous because it gives a very general commandment and it's not specific. It doesn't say detail. The Torah says, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, is holy. Meaning because God's holy, and God says, you are created in my image, you're like me, you're my nation, you should also be holy. And if I were to ask someone, what does it mean, be holy? Mazal, if we could have you volunteer off the top of your head, I'll ask you here, I'll click to unmute. What would you say it means when the God commands you be holy? Practically, what do I have to do? Do I have to meditate? Do I have to have these transcendental experiences?
For me, how do I connect to Hashem and treat myself as a holy vessel is I keep my house clean. I keep my life in order the best I can. I share wisdom and healing with every person that comes my way. whether they have means or not, to some extent, and to eat properly and consume the food that will nourish my soul so that I myself become a holy vessel for Hashem to realm in my space. That means that my home can accept it. Hashem, my home can accept Hashem. My spirit can accept Hashem, and I can grow my greatest gift and my direction. I can hear Hashem that way. I can hear him, and also to not watch TV.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's very good, very interesting points I hear. So let's see, Nachmanides, this was a rabbi, a great sage, who moved to Israel. He was from the founders probably about 800 or so years ago. He moved to Israel and established a synagogue. So he was from the few that were returning to Israel at a time when there weren't many living there. He's called Ramban, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachmanides, not to confuse with Rambam, which is Maimonides. So he describes and discusses what is the details included in this commandment, be holy, which is a very general, non-descriptive verse. So Sheila, if you'd like to please read text number 2.
The Torah prescribed certain sexual practices and forbade certain foods, but it permitted relations with one's wife and the consumption of meat and wine. The pleasure seeker may thus find license to be lecherous with his wife, to become a drunk, or consume an abundance of meat, or speak profanely, things which are not directly forbidden by the Torah. One might thus excuse his abominable behavior because it technically falls within the boundaries of the Torah. Therefore, this verse, you should be holy, is mentioned after the Torah has detailed all of the activities that are to be curtailed entirely. For it presents us with a general and comprehensive command that we are to be separated from overindulgence.
Very good. So Maimonides, he says, I'll tell you what this verse in Leviticus is trying to say. God says, after everything I told you, 613 commandments, one can try to say, you know what? Wherever God said I cannot do something, I won't. But wherever he said I can, I will be like an animal. I'll go full force, indulge myself, become someone that runs after my own cravings, and I could do it all in a permitted way. On that, God says, I'm not going to get into every detail. I'm not going to sit here and come up with every type of loophole that every Jew is going to think of, how he could still run after his own cravings and do crazy things that are inappropriate, but somehow justify that it still fits within the Torah boundaries. God says, let me give you a general principle. Be holy. Sort of like a mother will tell her son, just to use an example, be a mensch. What does the mother mean by be a mensch? She's trying to say, I don't need every single time to tell you that you have to throw your tissue in the garbage when you finish, and you have to close the door when you leave, and you have to tell someone when you cancel the meeting. She says, I want to just teach you a general principle that you'll get things on your own, that instead of me telling you each time, oh, you didn't do this, and you say, well, you never told me so, I'm trying to give you a general principle. Be a responsible, good person. So too God says, yes, I permitted one to be married, and I permitted one to eat. Does God want that we should every single day try out 16 restaurants? And even going a step further than what Nachmanides says. Biblically, one can marry a woman, divorce her the next day, marry another woman the next day, and another woman the next day, keep going from one woman to the next. So in that field, is it biblically permitted? Yes. Is that what God wants? God says no. You have to get the spirit of the law, be holy, and understand what is it that I'm trying to accomplish, and stop looking for saying, yes, I'll follow the commandments to the bare minimum, and everything else is completely okay. God is happy for me to do it. God is trying to give over a general picture of how one is supposed to be behaving. Let's read an example over here where this can apply a lot when it comes to Shabbat. this is something that's relevant till today. There's always questions. For example, texting on Shabbat. One knows that according to Jewish law, we don't use phones on Shabbat. We don't generate electricity, meaning if electricity is already on, we can use it, but we don't create something new. We don't turn on the phone. We don't initiate a phone call. So there are those that are trying to make an app on the phone that makes, I think this is already something that they gave up on, but at the time, this was a few years ago, there were some app developers were trying to make an app that basically the entire Shabbat uses energy on your phone as if you're making a call and texting. So therefore, if you actually text or call, it doesn't generate any new electricity. It's constantly draining your phone, and it'll have to, of course, be plugged in order that if you do text, you're not creating anything new. So of course, it's relying on many loopholes, and it's not something that everybody would agree with. And it's something that has to be tested. I never followed up as to what eventually happened with it, but I've never seen it on the market. But I know they were working on it. And then the question comes, let's say you were able to figure it out, that it's somehow permitted. You have to ask yourself, is this in the spirit of Shabbat? Is this what God intended when he says you should have one day of rest, where you focus on yourself, your life, what's going on with you? Does he want that we should figure out how to still work without breaking the laws that he gave us? Ultimately, God is not saying only this is prohibited. Everything else, try to find a loophole. He's trying to get us to be on the same page and understand the idea of resting on Shabbat. So let's read over here, Mazal, if you'd like to read the spirit of Shabbat and then text number 3.
Keeping Shabbat is much more than a list of do's and don'ts. It's a day of rest. I'm reading without my glasses. I'm winging it right now.
You're doing great.
In his commentary to a different verse, Nachmanides develops the idea regarding the festivals. Okay, now, we are commanded on the festivals to rest. Oh, thanks. You made it big for me. For those activities that technically do not qualify as work, we should not be disturbed all day to measure grain, weigh fruit and possessions, fill vessels with wine, and move wares. We shouldn't be preoccupied with building stones from house to house and place to place. Should these matters be permitted, the marketplace would be filled with ongoing commerce. The shops would be open and money changers' tables strewn with coins. Workers would arise for their duties and establish their daily wages, like the rest of the week, and so on. These and similar activities, whether on Yom Tov or even Shabbat itself, do not technically constitute this scripturally defined idea of work. Therefore, the Torah commands us with a more general term of rest, Shabbaton, namely that these should be days of rest and cessation of work, and not days of labor and toil.
Okay, great. So let me say outside, just to recap what he's saying. So he gives here an example. Yeah. He's giving here an example of this exact idea, which we discussed regarding being holy. He's discussing regarding Shabbat. God says, let it be a day of rest. And he tells us many things prohibited. But one can, let's say, leave all his work that is permitted on Shabbat for that day, and he'll continue working on Shabbat by only doing the aspects that are permitted. So he reorganizes his store and he sets everything up, takes it out of storage and puts it on the shelves. He could do that all on Shabbat in theory, but that's why God adds in the extra word and says Shabbaton, that it should be a day of rest, besides for all the laws, a general idea is it should be a day where you stop. So even if you're finding loopholes, you're missing the point. This is the same idea when we come to being holy. The mitzvot are not just there as a checklist, but it's to give us a general education in how one should behave properly, and we should expand it to areas as necessary. Okay. Let's continue with this. Eliyahu, if you'd like to read. Let me scroll out, drop, so you could see that. Yeah.
Oh. Two tiers working together. In the essay below, Rabbi Meir Twersky articulates the notion that halacha is not just a set of rules, but a way of life, of values. The Torah is not content with ensuring technically correct behavior. It also seeks to mold the human personality. Accordingly, it is concerned not only with our actions, but also the cause and purpose of those actions as well. The dual focus of Torah law has important repercussions of the methodology of deciding halacha. Any contemplated action, of course, or course of action must be evaluated on two levels. We must investigate if it is technically correct and permissible, viz., are any particulars of Torah violated. In addition, we must determine if the proposal is consistent with Torah principles, attitudes, values, and concepts. The permissibility of appropriateness of any particular action or initiative can only be determined after such a two-pronged analysis, practical and axiological, moral, ideological value.
Very good. So he says, we always have to ask ourselves, is this breaking a law? But in addition, is this aligned with Torah values? So let's look over here just to get some of these slides, which help us. If we look at these pictures, these are very close-up pictures, so you can see all those pixels. It's hard to identify sometimes what they are. However, if one backs up a little bit, they get to see that here you have a brush, here you have a pair of sneakers, a yarmulke with the Star of David on it, wearing on someone's head, and you have your menorah. This is the idea where sometimes people can get caught up with the rules and forget to see the larger picture. Torah is not just about the specific rule, did you break it or not, but it's back up a little bit and get to see the entire picture. Or as we'll say, this picture, is this okay? Is this what God, when he says you can eat kosher food, he wants one to look like this? This is the way an animal would eat. He wants us to be conscious about the foods we eat, how we eat it, to eat in a proper way. That is the spirit of the law that we have. Imagine this was the scene that you would see on Shabbat, that they're watching a TV show and they're trying to celebrate Shabbat. We would say, well, it doesn't exactly fit in that right atmosphere that we're trying to bring on Shabbat. To some degree, there's actually those that don't even think about anything mundane on Shabbat. Meaning one, according to the best practice, even though it's not completely prohibited, but one shouldn't spend the entire Shabbat to figure out calculations of their business and sit there with all their books, even though he says, well, I'm not writing and I'm not talking about it. Even thinking about the tasks and the work that we do during the week is missing the point as to why we're supposed to celebrate Shabbat. So section number 1 is about not missing the forest for the trees. This statement means sometimes you're looking at one tree, another tree, and you forget the big picture of the forest. Never forget what's the whole general purpose of the commandments. What is it trying to tell me in order to make sure that, yes, with doing the details, I'm focused on the second tier, which Eliyahu you just read, of making sure that it's aligned in general with the right goal. Let's get to the next. Well, we'll read first the summary and then we'll get to the next section. And Sheila, if you'd like to read summary.
We have covered the first big idea. Halakha is not just a list of do's and don'ts. Rather, there is also the spirit of the law and the general value behind the law. When we follow halakha, that must also reflect its values. In the following section, we will explore the second big idea.
Very good. So we have here the spirit of the law. Let's move on to section number 2. And Mazal, if you'd like to read beyond the letter of the law.
Beyond the letter of the law. The Torah itself wants us to go beyond the letter of the law. This is because, A, there are simply too many instances for the law to cover, and there are always loopholes to get around the law. And B, even when the Torah will not officially obligate someone to go to such an extent, it is still the spirit of the laws to do so.
So this section is going to say that the Torah itself wants us to do it, wants us to go beyond the letter of the law, because number one, it can't cover everything, and also it cannot obligate you, but that's the idea that it wants you to do. So let's start with text number 5, and we'll bring out the sources again. Where do we find this in the Torah? Aliyah, if you'd like to read from text number 5.
Okay. Diligently keep the commandments of the Torah, your God, and his testimonies and his statutes, which he has commanded you. And you shall do what is proper and good in the eyes of God, in order that it may be well with you, and that you may come and possess the good land, which God swore to your forefathers. What does it mean? Do what's proper and good in the eyes of God. Is that a reference of the mitzvot already stated, or is this a new commandment? If it is new, what are the details?
Good. So here we have the words in Hebrew. This is a verse that God commands us. Va'asivta hayashar v'hatov be'inei Hashem. Do what is good in the eyes of God, what's correct and what's good. And the question is, what does that include? So let's read the explanation Nachmanides gives, and I'll just say one out here before we read the text inside. The Talmud says that if one has a home or a field to sell, and he's looking for a price, and he has many buyers, many people are willing to pay the price that he wants, who should he sell to? So one of the laws are that in order to fulfill this commandment, the primary person you should sell to, if everybody is the same price, you should primarily sell to your neighbor, the one that's right next door, because it's easier for someone to plow 2 fields that are next to each other or take care of 2 homes that are right next to each other. So because for you, it doesn't make a difference who you sell to, everybody's offering the same price. For the people that are buying, only this one needs specifically this home because it's next to his primary home or primary field. Therefore, to do the right thing, sell to him. So that's an example the Talmud gives of what's included in this law. But let's read what Nachmanides explains as to what is the Torah commanding us when it says, do what's right. Sheila, if you'd like to read.
Our rabbis in the beautiful Midrash said, this refers to acting beyond the strict demands of the law. The idea is that first, God tells us to keep his commandments, testimonies, and laws as he commanded them. And now God adds, even regarding those things that I did not explicitly command, pay attention to what is good and right in God's eyes, because God loves goodness and righteousness. This is a fundamental idea because it's impossible to mention in the Torah what should be everyone's conduct with their neighbors and friends in any business matters and regarding ordinances of any town or country.
Okay, continue.
So after stating many such examples, such as do not gossip, Leviticus, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. You shall not insult the deaf. You shall rise before the aged. The Torah circles back and says once more in a general way, do what is good and right regarding everything, including compromise, acting beyond the strict demands of the law. Shall I read the last one?
Yeah, so this is just to recap a second. Nachmanides says, God gives us the many details, and then he recaps everything and says, just do what's right. I gave you a lot of examples. With those examples, you should figure this out on your own as to what is correct, what is incorrect. Yeah, and if you could read that, please.
Additionally, you can always find loopholes in the law and get around it. Therefore, the Torah gives us a general rule which should guide our behavior in a certain way. Lifnim Meshurat Hayden is obligatory.
Yeah, so the words in Hebrew are very good. It's lifnim mishurat hadin, which means beyond the letter of the law, doing more than what's required or demanded. As we all know, a good student or a good teacher, a good child is always, a good parent is always one that does more than just required. Who's the best teacher in the school? The one that's not just coming in, clocking in their time and leaving when necessary, but they show interest in the children. They invest some of their own money into the school, into the class. They want to spend time with them out of school. They're involved in more than what's required. That's always what makes it a better connection. So let's pull up this slide over here a moment. Which of the following commandments includes all the rest? Option A, do what is good and right regarding everything. B is do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor being spilled, or don't take vengeance, do not gossip. And the answer, of course, is A. God says after the other examples, B, C, and D, which are commandments, he gives us commandment number A and says, in general, do what is correct, what is right in God's eyes. And this is lifnim mishurat hadin, beyond the letter of the law. Because if you're just going to follow the law, as you have in this little joke over here, I guess you would call it, this guy's a loop. He says, my loophole out loopholes your loophole. If you're just going to work on contracts and trying to prevent every loophole, people are going to sit there and constantly find more and more loopholes. So one has to say, yes, maybe this is not written clearly, but it's not appropriate. Whereas we'll have this option where someone just doesn't get it. The sheriff park ranger is telling him it says no fishing, and he says, yeah, I'm not fishing, I'm hunting. Correct. Maybe your legal term is that you're hunting. However, the idea is the same. You're missing the point. What we don't want you to do is killing these fish. And as we have over here on this slide, the Torah doesn't just want us to follow blindly, step by step, and then be any type of person. It wants us to change our whole attitude of being in the spirit of the law. We'll use an example here when sometimes people can say things that are not offensive on their own, but they can give over that type of impression. We're going to get to this actually. Let's read a few more of the text and we'll get back to that. And Mazal, if you'd like to read over here, let's do, I'll say the introduction outside. The law is that one has to return a lost item. However, Jewish law says that if you're a person that is old or very respected, and if you lost that item, you wouldn't even return your own item, then you don't have to return someone else's. So for example, let's say you're a very respected person, you're the mayor of the city. And if you had your bicycle broke, you wouldn't pick up the broken pieces and walk with it through town, because it would be very disrespectful for you as a mayor to walk through town with a broken bike. You would just leave your bike and say, whatever, it's fine. I'm not going to embarrass myself for it. This is not something I would do for my own bike. Such a person, if they find a lost item from someone else, that is something that if it was their own, they would not pick it up. They don't have to pick it up. Meaning you're not required to embarrass yourself for someone else's item that you wouldn't do for yourself, because it's ultimately based on treat others like you want to be treated. Since you wouldn't do this for yourself, you don't have to embarrass yourself for someone else's sake. However, if you're a guy that walks the whole day down the street with broken parts of a bike and you find someone else's, yes, you're required to pick it up. So this is the law that the Talmud is discussing. So let's read this text where the Talmud asks a question as to seemingly there was a great rabbi that went and returned something that he should have not been required to return. So Mazal, if you'd like to read text number 7.
Okay. Yeah. Talmud Tractic, Baba Metzia 30b. But wasn't Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yoshi, the elderly person? Was it not in keeping with his dignity to tend to the item? In the case of Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yoshi, he conducted himself beyond the letter of the law, and he could have simply refused the request for help. It was taught in the Baraita.
Yeah, Braita.
Is that like the Bhagavad Gita? Is that the same thing, that Indian writing? Is that the same?
No, so Baraita is the teachings that were taught with the times of the Mishnah, but they were taught outside. It wasn't incorporated as the primary text, but rather as the secondary text. So it's called the Braita. It's like a sister to the Mishnah.
Nice. That they must perform, that is referring to acting beyond the letter of the law.
Okay, continue reading the text.
As Rabbi Yohanan said, Jerusalem was destroyed only for the fact that they adjudicated cases on the basis of Torah law in the city. The Gemara asks, rather than what else should they have done, should they rather have adjudicated cases on the basis of arbitrary decisions? Rather say that they established their rulings on the basis of Torah law and did not go beyond the letters of the law.
Very good. So let's clarify a little bit what we read over here from the Talmud. So the Talmud says, why did this rabbi return something that he wasn't obligated to return? It wasn't for his respect and honor as a great rabbi to return something that was so minimal. He wouldn't do it for his own item. And the Talmud answers that he went above the letter of the law. He went beyond what he was required to do. And we learned it out from a verse that when God says what you will do is referring to beyond the letter of the law. The acts that you will perform is beyond the letter of the law. It has it in greater detail on the Hebrew side, and you can check up the Talmud if you're looking for a greater reference. In English, they just give down the summary. And this is what the Talmud explains, one of the reasons why Jerusalem was destroyed. It says because they followed the Torah law. So the Talmud asks, what do you mean because they follow the Torah law? That's the best thing that's the greatest compliment you could give. That's the best thing they should do. Which law do you think they should follow? And that the Talmud answers, no. They follow the Torah law, but only to the T and nothing beyond. They didn't get the idea of being a mensch, being responsible, understanding when a person should sometimes bend over a little backwards and going beyond what's required. They literally did what they had to do and run away. You're not going to become a professor if every day you come to school exactly on time and you run away as soon as school is over. If you really want to devote yourself to school, you come early, you leave late, you study on your own time. The Jews at the time were very just doing what was required and then bouncing. And therefore, it says Judaism was not able to survive in Jerusalem, and ultimately Jerusalem was destroyed. Let's read over here inside. Sheila, if you'd like to read text number 8, which explains this idea.
Lock-up man takes up his stand in the midst of the concrete world, his feet planted firmly on the ground of reality, and he looks about and sees, listens and hears, and publicly protests against the oppression of the helpless, the defrauding of the poor, the plight of the orphan. The rich are deemed as naught in his view. He is the father of orphans and the judge of widows. My uncle, Rabbi Meyer Barlin, told me that once Rabbi Chaim Abrisk was asked what the function of a rabbi is. Rabbi Chaim replied, to redress the grievances of those who are abandoned and alone, to protect the dignity of the poor, and to save the oppressed from the hands of his oppressor. Neither ritual decision nor political leadership constitutes the main task of halakhic man. Far from it. The actualization of the ideals of justice and righteousness is the pillar of fire, which halakhic man follows when he, as a rabbi and teacher in Israel, serves his community.
Very good. So this is explaining that it's not just about knowing the laws, but it's about actually becoming a better person, caring for others, worrying about those that are being abandoned or oppressed. That is the responsibility of one that is trying to connect with God and follow his laws. Don't just focus on what you have to do, but understand the message it's trying to teach you on how you have to become a person that's more kind, caring, and a more sensitive person. Let's read the summary for this section. Elia, if you'd like to read.
We have covered the second big idea. The Torah itself wants us to go beyond the letter of the law. This is because A, there are simply too many instances for the law to cover, and there are always loopholes to get around the law. And B, even when the Torah will not officially obligate someone to go to such an extent, it is still the spirit of the laws to do so. In the following section, we will explore the third and final big idea.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the third idea, and that is to explain now the advantage of actually having beyond the letter of the law. So now we explain how this is something that is meant to be, that we're supposed to understand it on our own, because not everything can be told and some things have to be done on our own. And here we're going to explain that there's actually a greater relationship and a greater connection when we do things on our own. So Mazal, if you'd like to read introduction to idea number 3. Let me unmute over there. Yep, there we go.
A relationship with God. We are God's children, essentially in relationship with him. Oftentimes, relationships are defined by the things we do for each other, even when not explicitly asked.
Very good. So this is the defining part of this section. We'll explain in greater detail that a good relationship is when you can do something even when you weren't asked. How do you know someone really cares for you? When they're out there looking for opportunities on their own, not just when you ask them, that's when they kick in. This is how we have a good relationship with God. Let's read a story here, which will help us understand this idea. And Sheila, if you'd like to start from a loving relationship and then read the story.
Okay. A loving relationship, you don't need to be asked. Another important aspect of going beyond the letter of the law means not doing only exactly what we're told, nothing more and nothing less, but being so much in turn and in love with one another that one party intuits what the other wants without being asked. Shall I read the story?
Yeah, please.
3 Jews, Beryl, Yankel, and Shmuel, were discussing who loves their wife the most. I love my wife, said Beryl. That's why I do everything she asks me to do. She says, Beryl, please take out the garbage. And right away, I take out the garbage. And all 3 nodded and agreed that Beryl certainly loves his wife. Not to be outdone, Yankel said, I also do everything my wife asks me to do. In fact, she doesn't even have to spell out what she wants. It's enough that she says, phew, that garbage bag is sure smelling up the kitchen for me to understand that she wants me to take out the garbage, which I do, of course. All 3 enthusiastically bobbed their heads up and down, agreeing that Yankel loves his wife even more than Beryl loves his wife. But in the end, it turned out that Shmuel's marriage was the most loving of all. Shmuel's wife doesn't have to ask her husband to do things for her. She doesn't even have to drop hints. I wake up in the morning, Shmuel explained, and I just know that she wants me to take out the garbage or buy her a diamond ring. She doesn't have to crinkle her nose or mention the ring her cousin Sarah got for her birthday. I just know what she wants me to do for her, and I do it.
Very good. So this story is to bring out the relationship that we have with God can be the same thing. Do we need God to tell us exactly every single thing? that shows on a little bit of like a babyish type of relationship where everything the mother has to tell the child. As you grow older, you become mature and you figure it out on your own. Let's look again. We'll bring the source for this idea. Let's read inside the Talmud this concept. And Eliyav, if you'd like to read, starting with I love the words, and then text number 9, and then the following lines.
I love the words of the rabbis. This idea is played out in numerous ways in halacha. We will now focus on the Talmud's approach to the words of the rabbis and subsequently the various customs or minhagim that Jewish communities have added throughout the ages. The Talmud states in text 9, the words and enactments of the rabbis are like adornments to the Torah. In fact, they are more precious than the words of the Torah. What should I do the text?
Yeah, please.
What is this cryptic Talmudic statement supposed to mean? How could the words of the rabbis be even more precious than the words of the Torah itself? We know that they are important, as we have learned at length in many lessons so far, but are they really more precious than the Torah?
Very good. And so continuing now with text 10.
Rabbeinu Yonah offers a deeper explanation. Know that fear of heaven is the foundation for all mitzvot, and it is what God wants from his creations. The guardrails of the sages are a foundation for fear of heaven, for they place safeguards lest a person touch a prohibition from the Torah. It is akin to the owner of a field that erects a fence around his field because it is dear to him, for he is afraid people might enter or animals may trample over it. That the many guardrails and safeguards around the Torah's prohibitions are the stuff of fear. One who is vigilant in his fear will certainly attain great reward. Thus, it is stated, the words of the sages are more dear than the depths of Torah itself, for their enactments and safeguards are the primary pathways for heavenly fear, for which there is great reward, equal to all other mitzvos, for it underpins them all.
Very good. So to recap what he explains, he gives the basic explanation that why are the words of the sages more dear than the Torah itself? So on the one hand, on a simple level, one can say because they explain the words of the Torah. But he says even more. The Torah is trying to teach us a relationship with God where we respect God. We have a certain awe of God's presence. And the words of the rabbis are there to help us put up those boundaries at earlier stages to make sure we don't transgress, we don't go too far over the line of doing what is prohibited. But let's continue explaining this same idea just from a positive approach, which will be a lot easier for us to understand. Why would the words of the sages be greater than the words of the Torah? So Sheila, if you'd like to read drawing from, and then we'll read text 11.
Drawing from different verses, Rabbeinu Yonah teaches that following the Torah and its commands is about fearing God. In that spirit, everything the rabbis enacted and explained was to this end, to enhance our fear of God. The very nature of enacting a guardrail around something, as so many of the rabbinic enactments are, is because one is afraid of ruining the matter that's being guarded. As such, it turns out that the rabbinic enactments are the expression of our fear of heaven, and that's why they're so dear to us. Continuing on this thread, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Miyadi develops the idea of the opposite end of the emotional spectrum, from fear to love. If rabbinic enactments are about enhancing fear, they're also expressions of added love. Rabbi Shneir Zalman's words in the original are quite esoteric, and they have been paraphrased many times. Here is one example of the Lubavitcher rabbi's reading. Should I read that?
Yeah, please read text 11.
Our sages state the rabbi's words are more precious than the words of the Torah. The reason for this is the Torah's words are what a person is obligated to do. As such, the commitment a Jew demonstrates when he or she follows them is limited to the simple reality that they follow instructions. The connection of a Jew creates with God when fulfilling a rabbinic enactment is much deeper. The fact that a Jew is not satisfied with simply fulfilling what the Torah instructs, rather he or she adds on guardrails, etc., demonstrates that their Torah commitment is one of true joy and pleasure. This amounts to a much deeper relationship with God.
Very good. So here he explains it in the positive side of it. He says, when a person wants to bring out their relationship to God is on their own, something that they appreciate, therefore they add to it and they're excited for it. Think of it as a relationship when one is married in the beginning, when they're super excited about their spouse, they're buying them gifts and they're writing them love letters and they're caring for them so much to do whatever is necessary because they feel such a strong connection. They want to go above and beyond what's required. So too, the idea of what the rabbis are sharing, meaning customs or minhagim, which is the word in Hebrew, that communities take upon themselves, in a way they're more cherished than the original commandments because it's areas where we are expressing our own love on our own without being required to do so. It's like what your spouse does or what your parents do that they're obligated to do is not as appreciated as the small things that they're not obligated to do, but they do it on their own. Why? Because that shows that they truly are thinking and caring and loving about you. And that's why they're going above and beyond. This is where the person is bringing out the extra bit that's not required, but because it's extra, it's so much more special. So I'll read this section. This is the reason why we are so obsessed with halacha, which is halacha, Jewish law, and are never satisfied to simply do what we have to do. Because if you're involved just because you have to be, then of course you'll do what you must, but not anything beyond that. You're not personally invested in a relationship, so it doesn't take the power. It doesn't take you past the letter of the law. Think of it as a prisoner. Prisoners will never build up a company like you have people that go to work because they don't feel like they want to be there. They're interested. They do exactly what they have to, and that's it. Anything extra that they're doing is just because they want to get out on parole a little earlier. When a person is feeling interested, they're building up a company because it's their initiative. They're excited about it. They're putting in their heart and soul. You're in a relationship for the long haul, happy and really excited about it. And of course, you'll look for everything, for whatever you can do to keep it going. Well, you have over here, this is what he was explaining, that safes and fences show the preciousness of the items that we're guarding. This is what we read before from Rabbeinu Yonah about the words on a simple level. The words of the rabbis are precious because they help guard the words of the Torah. But even more so, on a deeper level, we explained it out of love, that if you're in a relationship for the long haul, you look for whatever you can do to keep it going. You're not just going to do the bare minimum. So we love what's not required even more because it shows on our true commitment. Think of it as this question: can you manufacture joy? If one is not happy, can we make a plant that generates joy and you just buy this bottle, you drink it, and you're happy? An answer, of course, is no. Joy comes from if you are interested, excited, you feel like this is something that you want to do, you'll have joy. If you don't like a certain food, you cannot say, I'm joyous about it. I don't like it. I don't like this person. I don't like this environment. I don't like this color. I don't like this house or this community. And therefore, you won't have the joy. But if you have joy in something, I say, you know what? If you're having joy, you could not manufacture it. The only way you're joyous about it is because you really love it. You're really feeling connected with it. You're feeling like this is something you're viewing as a great opportunity to enhance what you're trying to do. And if your goal is a connection with God, you're joyous because you feel like this enhances your connection to God. Think of the idea of we celebrate on Simchat Torah. We dance with the Torah. That's bringing out our love for the Torah and for God. Yes, maybe sometimes it could be difficult, like we were discussing in the beginning of the class. Sometimes the commandments can be gruesome, just like anything good in life can be difficult sometimes. Having children, being married, starting up your business, everyone will tell you, of course, there were hard times. However, They pushed through the hard times because ultimately there was a love beneath it that said, I really want to have children that I can raise. I really want to have a great relationship. I really want to build up my business and become wealthy. And therefore, the love overrides all the challenges. So when one expresses joy, when one initiates in a certain field, you know that he's really thinking about it. No one comes up with great ideas because I wasn't thinking about it, but I just invented the iPhone. It comes from someone having such a passion and interest that they're thinking about this constantly, that therefore they initiate. So when we have customs that we initiate, getting back to the idea of the third section, it shows on our extra love to God that we're saying not just what you want us to do, we do, but we go even above and beyond it. The idea of celebrating Simchat Torah is not a law in the Torah. It's not a biblical holiday. It's something that we do when we finish reading the Torah. The first time we find it recorded is only 600 years ago. The Torah was given over 3,000 years ago. But the idea of dancing with the Torah is when we finish it is something that became popular, you could say, only 600 years ago. And yet it's probably the most joyous day in the Jewish calendar, precisely because it's not something we were told to do. It's something we did on our own. That's what makes it so exciting. That shows that we are interested. This is something that we want to partake in. I'll just show you a short clip over here, some of the dancing. This was recorded in Israel. It's called Hakafot Shniyot. Outside of Israel, we have the holiday for 2 days, and we're not allowed to record during the holiday. In Israel, they only have the holiday for 1 day. All holidays are 1 day in Israel, besides for Rosh Hashanah, which is a separate discussion. And because they only have 1 day, but this is a joyous holiday, it became customary now that they dance the additional day after the holiday, where outside of Israel is still holiday. They do dancing in many communities throughout Israel with the Torah, and because it's not a holiday, but it's just celebrating the holiday an additional day, one is allowed to record then and play music and so forth, everything that's going on in the video. So let's finish with the last text in this section, and then we will go on to the summary. So I'll say this outside this section. There was in the temple, there was something called Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the joy of the drawing of the water. It was considered the most joyous time in the temple. And it says, the Talmud says, we'll have over here this quote, that one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water, in Hebrew, Simchat Beit HaShoeva, never saw celebration in his days. It was the greatest joy ever. It says for days they were dancing in the temple. There were people juggling fire and lighting up different candles that they had that would light up the whole Jerusalem. And the question is, why was it so joyous? It's not even a commandment in the Torah. And the answer is precisely because it's not from the Torah, but it was a custom, something that came down, that custom of dancing by the drawing of the water in the temple. That's something that came down from Moses by Mount Sinai, not like Simchat Torah, which was a custom that only happened 600 years ago, but similar in the sense that they're both not clear commandments in the Torah, and yet they're very joyous because it is something that we're showing our participation, that we're excited about it. We want to initiate. We're not just running away because we're not interested and we're just doing what we have to do. Okay. Let's just read this last text, number 17. And Eliaf, if you'd like to read text number 17.
This very matter is the explanation. The deeper the joy is, the force of the obligation decreases, for the joy springs forth from the Jewish people's initiative. So in our case, the joy associated with a matter explicitly stated in the Torah, namely an obligation equally incumbent upon everyone, demonstrates something that applies even to the lowest common denominator. By contrast, the hakafo of Simchat Torah is not an obligation per se, not even a rabbinical decree. Rather, it is only a custom. As such, it demonstrates a deep joy, a joy that springs forth from the Jewish people themselves, something they innovated, and a joy that they carry through.
Yeah, very good. So it's not about how much it's necessary. It's about how much was this not necessary, and yet you did it. Meaning one appreciates from their spouse a small gesture that they do that wasn't required, a lot more than all the large gestures of paying the bills and getting a car and a house and a vacation. But these are things that are sort of expected, and therefore they're not as joyous. Let's read the summary for this class. We'll do over here the key points. Let's start with the first one. Sheila, if you'd like to read this page.
Okay, halakha is not just a list of do's and don'ts. It's a set of values. Although the trees are important, we cannot miss the forest. Besides, for the technical laws, God wants us to be holy. This means not to overindulge, etc. One must be sure to actually rest in Shabbat and not just technically not do malakha.
Yeah, which malacha is the Hebrew word for work. So this is the section number one, the big idea number one, and that is halacha is not just don't pass this line and everything else is okay, but it's trying to teach us a set of values and see the big picture of how it wants you to behave, that you shouldn't act like an animal with permission from the Torah because you didn't break any law, but get the idea of what the Torah is trying to teach you and then apply it in your practical life. The Torah doesn't have to get into every nitty-gritty detail to say that this is not appropriate. Okay, Eliaf, you'd like to read 4 and 5?
We must also go beyond the law, or lifnim mishurat hadin. Firstly, because the law simply cannot cover every single instance and preclude every loophole. Secondly, even when the law explicitly does not require us to go to such an extent, it is still the spirit of the law. And 5, a true loving partnership is one in which the two parties are so connected and in love that they do things for each other, even when not explicitly asked.
Very good. So that's how you know that it's a great relationship when it wasn't required. So therefore, us going beyond the letter of the law brings out the great relationship that we can have with God. And I'll read 6, 7, 8, 9. So we are God's children, essentially in a relationship with him. This is why the words of the rabbis are even more precious than the words of the Torah itself. And that's in quotation from the Talmud, because safeguards and fences indicate the preciousness of the items that are the item they are guarding. So number one, on a simple level, the words of the rabbis are precious because it shows us if they have to make laws and safeguards, fences around it, means it's so precious, like a safe that you would have on your jewels or money. But in addition, halacha brings us much joy as it is an opportunity to enhance our relationship with God. How does it enhance the relationship with God? It shows that it's not just something that I have to do, but it's something that I want to initiate on my own because it's an opportunity to bring out the true essence of what my soul wants to do. And point number 9, the last point, when we do something out of our own initiative, we are happier because it expresses just how in love we are with God and that we're able to intuit our own what he wants. We could come up on our own and understand what is it that God wants. Okay. With that, we conclude this last class. Thank you all for joining.